Hello, friends. We are very interested to know which cities you are listening to us from, so quickly like and write in the comments where you are from. Also share what shocking stories happened in your city or maybe even with you personally. Subscribe because the next story could be about your city or even your personal drama. Now let's dive into a new exciting story. Allison Davis stood at the kitchen stove, stirring pasta sauce. The aroma of basil and garlic filled the cozy kitchen of their home in the suburbs of Chicago. Outside the window, the October evening enveloped the street in the soft light of the street lamps, but inside Allison felt her heart beating faster than usual. Today, she was going to take a step that could change her and Thomas's lives. She straightened a stray strand of brown hair and glanced at her watch. 7 o'clock in the evening. Thomas was about to return from work. She set the table with great care, a white tablecloth, their finest china, 2 glasses of red wine. Allison wanted everything to look perfect, as if a beautiful table setting could soften the upcoming conversation. She was 35, and after 10 years of marriage, she felt routine slowly tightening its grip on her. While working as an interior designer was rewarding, she felt trapped at home. Thomas, her husband, was reliable, loving, but predictable, and Allison longed for something more, something that would make her feel alive again. The door slammed and footsteps were heard in the hallway. Allison took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and turned toward the door. "Hi, honey," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "Dinner is almost ready." Thomas Davis, tall with short dark hair and tired eyes, walked into the kitchen, loosening his tie. His suit was slightly wrinkled after a long day in the office, where he, as a financial analyst, sorted through endless spreadsheets and reports. He smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. "It smells delicious," he said, putting his briefcase against the wall. "It's been a long day." "Tell me," Allison answered, pouring wine into glasses. She handed one to him, trying to hide her nervousness. "Anything interesting?" Thomas shrugged, accepting the glass. "The usual. Clients, numbers, deadlines. How's your day?" Allison smiled, but inside her thoughts were racing. She wanted to get to the main point, but was afraid that the moment was not yet right. Instead, she began talking about her day, meeting with a client who wanted to redo the living room in a minimalist style, how she spent hours choosing the perfect shade of gray for the walls. Thomas listened, nodding, but Allison felt that his thoughts were somewhere far away. They sat down at the table and Allison served shrimp pasta. The first glass of wine helped her relax, and she decided it was time. She cleared her throat, looking at Thomas over her glass. "Tom, I wanted to talk to you about us." Thomas looked up from his plate, his eyebrows raised slightly. "About us? Did something happen?" Allison took a sip of wine to buy time. Her fingers nervously fiddled with the edge of the tablecloth. "No, nothing happened. It's just, we've been married for 10 years, and I've been wondering about how we live, about what we want." Thomas put the spoon down and looked at her more closely. His face was calm, but there was a hint of wariness in his eyes. "What are you getting at, Allison?" She took a deep breath. The words she had been rehearsing in front of the mirror suddenly seemed foreign to her, but it was too late to retreat. "I think we should try something new. In our relationship, maybe open our marriage." The silence that followed her words was almost palpable. Thomas froze, his fingers holding the glass tense. Allison felt the blood rush to her cheeks, but she forced herself to continue. "I'm not saying that I don't love you, Tom. You know how much you mean to me. It's just, I feel like we're missing a spark. Maybe if we give each other a little space, it will revive us." Thomas slowly put his glass down on the table. His face remained expressionless, but Allison saw his jaw tighten slightly. "Open the marriage," he repeated, as if tasting the words. "Are you serious?" Allison nodded, trying to look confident. "Yes, I've read about this, and many couples say it helps. We could make rules to keep things fair. I just want us both to be happy." Thomas looked at her, and Allison suddenly felt like she was under a microscope. She expected him to argue, to be indignant, but his silence was worse. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was colder than she expected. How long have you been thinking about this? Allison hesitated. She couldn't tell the truth that the idea had started several months ago when she met Jake Hartman at an art exhibition. Jake, with his wild blonde hair and cocky smile, was the exact opposite of Thomas. He was an artist, a free spirit, and his attention made Allison feel welcome in a way she had long forgotten. Their meetings began as innocent conversations over coffee, but soon grew into something more. Allison didn't plan to cheat, but with Jake, she couldn't stop. Not that long ago, she lied, looking away. It's just, I feel like we're stuck, Tom. Don't you feel the same? Thomas leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. His eyes, usually warm, now seemed as cold as the winter sky. Stuck, he repeated. Interesting choice of words. What exactly do you want to change? What are you missing? Allison felt her irritation growing. She expected him to resist, but his calmness infuriated her. I'm not saying I'm missing something, she said, raising her voice. I just want us to try something new. Haven't you ever thought about what it would be like to meet someone else, try something different? Thomas leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharpening. What did you think? He asked quietly. About meeting someone else? Allison froze. There was something in his tone that made her heart skip a beat. She forced herself to smile, but it came out forced. It's just an idea, Tom. I'm not saying that I have already decided something. I want us to discuss this together. Thomas nodded, but his face remained expressionless. Okay, he said finally, I will think. Allison blinked, not expecting this reaction. She thought he would argue and demand an explanation, but his agreement unsettled her. Is it true? She asked, unable to hide her surprise. True, he answered, getting up from the table. I need to check something in the office. Thanks for dinner. He left the kitchen, leaving Allison alone. She sat, looking at the half-drunk glass of wine, and tried to understand what went wrong. She got what she wanted, he didn't say no, but somehow she felt worse than before the conversation. His coldness, his gaze. Something was wrong. Allison stood up to clear the table, but her mind was elsewhere. She remembered Jake, his laugh, his touch. She wasn't going to tell Thomas about him, at least not yet. But now that she had taken the first step, she felt on the edge of an abyss. And something told her that Thomas knew more than he was letting on. Later, Allison lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while Thomas read a book nearby. The silence between them was heavy, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just started a chain of events that could no longer be stopped. Volume, she called quietly. He didn't take his eyes off the book. You'll think about it, won't you? Is it true? He closed the book and looked at her. His eyes were unreadable. I said I'll think about it, Allison. Good night. He turned off the lamp and the room went dark. Allison lay listening to his even breathing, and for the first time in a long time, she felt that she did not know the person lying next to her. Allison did not suspect that Thomas was not checking work emails in his office, as he said. He sat at the table, looking at the photo he found in her notebook a few weeks ago. In the photo, Allison was laughing as she stood next to a young man with disheveled hair. Thomas didn't know who he was, but he was going to find out. Thomas Davis sat at his desk in his office on the 23rd floor of a skyscraper in downtown Chicago. Outside the window, it was raining on a gray Friday morning, and the drops ran down the glass like tears. Tables with financial forecasts flickered on the monitor screen in front of him, but his thoughts were far from the numbers. He twirled the pen in his fingers, and the events of the previous night replayed in his head. Dinner, Allison's words, her proposal to open the marriage. This phrase resonated in his chest with a dull pain, like the blow of a hammer. Thomas leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. When did he start to suspect? It was hard to say exactly. Maybe 3 months ago, when Allison first came home later than usual, with a vague explanation about a long meeting with a client. Or when he noticed how she started checking her phone more often, moving him out of her sight if he got too close. Or maybe it was the smell, the light, subtle aroma of someone else's cologne on her scarf, which he found in the hallway. At first, he dismissed these thoughts. Allison was his wife, his partner, the mother of their failed plans for children. But doubts, like seeds, had taken root, and now they were growing, poisoning his peace. He opened his eyes and looked at the framed photo on the table. Him and Allison on the beach in Mexico, 5 years ago. She laughed, hugging him by the shoulders, and he looked at her with such love that even now this memory cut him in the heart. Where is Allison? And who is this woman who sat opposite him yesterday and offered to refresh their marriage? Thomas took out his phone and opened his contacts. His finger hovered over the name Margaret Wilson. He met Margaret, a family lawyer, at a corporate event a year ago. Then he didn't think that he would ever turn to her for help. But yesterday's conversation with Allison changed everything. He dialed the number. Margaret Wilson, came a clear, confident voice on the other end. Margaret, this is Thomas Davis. We met at a reception at Hartford Investments last fall. Thomas, of course I remember. How can I help? Thomas paused, looking at the rain outside the window. Words came with difficulty. I need advice. It's personal, about my marriage. I understand. Margaret's voice became softer, but retained a professional tone. Let's meet. Is 2 o'clock in my office today okay? Yes, great. Thank you. After hanging up, Thomas felt the tension in his chest ease slightly. He wasn't ready for divorce yet, but he needed to know what his options were. And most importantly, he needed to understand how far Allison had gone. Meanwhile, Allison stood in Jake Hartman's studio, a loft on the outskirts of town. The space was littered with canvases, tubes of paint, and old coffee cups. The smell of turpentine mingled with the aroma of freshly brewed espresso Jake had just placed in front of her. He was wearing his usual clothes, faded jeans, a white t-shirt with paint stains, and unkempt blonde hair. Allison looked at him and felt her pulse quicken. Jake was the exact opposite of Thomas, spontaneous, unpredictable, lively. Are you okay? Jake asked, sitting down on the chair opposite her. His blue eyes studied her face carefully. You look tense. Allison forced herself to smile and took a sip of her coffee. It's just, yesterday was a strange evening. I spoke to Thomas. Jake raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. About us? There was no alarm in his voice, only curiosity. No, not really. Allison looked away, looking at the unfinished painting on the easel. I invited him to open our marriage. Jake whistled, his lips curling into a smile. Seriously? And how did he take it? Allison shrugged, trying to hide her confusion. Not as I expected. He didn't argue, he just said he'd think about it. But he was cold. I don't know how to describe it. Jake leaned closer, his hand lightly brushing her fingers. Maybe he's just in shock. It's not something people usually hear at dinner. Give him time. Allison nodded, but inside she was tormented by doubts. She didn't tell Jake how much Thomas's gaze, his calmness, scared her. She expected screams, questions, but his silence was worse. And yet, sitting here with Jake, she felt alive. He made her laugh, dream, feel like the Allison she had been before marriage, before all those years of routine. And you? Jake asked, his voice becoming quieter. Are you sure you want this? Open marriage? Allison looked into his eyes. She wasn't sure, but the thought of losing Jake scared her more than the possible consequences. I want to be happy, she finally said, and with you I'm happy. Jake smiled, and this time his smile was softer. He took her hand and brought it to his lips, lightly kissing her knuckles. Then let's just enjoy the moment, okay? Allison nodded, but the guilt she had been trying to suppress rose in her chest again. She loved Thomas, or at least she thought she did. But with Jake, it was different, and she wasn't ready to choose. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Thomas entered Margaret Wilson's office, located in an elegant building in the business district. Margaret, a tall woman of about 45 with short gray hair and piercing eyes, rose from the table to greet him. Thomas, good to see you, she said, shaking his hand. Take a seat. Coffee? No, thank you. Thomas sat down, feeling out of place. The office was decorated with taste, dark wood, leather chairs, city views, but now it only increased his discomfort. Margaret sat down opposite her, folding her hands on the table. So, Tell me what's going on. Thomas took a deep breath. He was not used to sharing personal things, but he had no choice. I think my wife is cheating on me, he said, and the words sounded heavier than he expected. Yesterday, she offered to open our marriage, but I suspect she's already started. Margaret nodded, her face remaining expressionless. Do you have proof? Not yet. Only suspicions. She comes back late, hides her phone, sometimes smells. Different than usual. This is not evidence, Margaret said softly but firmly. But this is a cause for concern. If you want to protect yourself legally and financially, you need facts. I can recommend a private detective. It works quickly and discreetly. Thomas nodded, although the thought of hiring someone to spy on Allison made him feel sick. And then what? What if I get proof? Then we will have options, Margaret replied. Do you have a marriage contract? Yes. We signed it before the wedding. Great. Send me a copy, I'll take a look. If it comes to divorce, this can protect your assets. But for now, let's focus on gathering information. Don't make hasty moves, Thomas. Emotions are your worst advisor right now. Thomas nodded, but his thoughts were churning inside. He didn't want a divorce. He wanted everything to be the same as before. But Allison's words, her proposal, they had broken something in him, and he wasn't sure if it could be fixed. That evening, Allison returned home later than planned. She entered the house, leaving her bag in the hallway, and froze when she noticed the light in Thomas's office. He rarely worked at home in the evenings. She knocked on the door and looked inside. Are you still awake? She asked, trying to make her voice sound casual. Thomas was sitting at the table with his laptop open in front of him. He looked up, and for a second Allison thought she saw a shadow flicker in his eyes. Just finishing up something, he said. You're late. Yes, I met with a client, she lied, feeling the lie weigh on her. The language is too easy. New project, a lot of ideas. Thomas nodded but didn't smile. Fine. Good night, Allison. Good night, she answered, closing the door. Her heart was pounding. He didn't say anything, but something in his tone, in his gaze, made her feel caught. Allison sat at a table in the corner of the Bean and Brew Cafe in downtown Chicago, nervously tapping her fingers on the rim of her coffee cup. Morning light streamed through the large windows, reflecting off the polished wood floors, and the aroma of freshly brewed espresso mingled with the smell of warm croissants. She glanced at her watch. Linda was late, as always. Allison was finishing her latte when the cafe door swung open and Linda Carter walked in as if the stage was hers alone. Her long blonde hair was styled in loose waves, and her bright red lipstick stood out against her black coat. She spotted Allison, waved, and headed toward the table, drawing glances from the other patrons. Sorry, honey, traffic jams, Linda said, throwing her purse on the chair and sitting down opposite. Have you ordered anything for me yet? Allison smiled despite her annoyance. Linda has always been like this, bright, loud, a little selfish. But it was this energy that had once attracted Allison, back in college, when they became friends. Your cappuccino is on the way, Allison replied, nodding toward the bar. How are you? Oh, as always, I live life to the fullest. Linda winked, adjusting her scarf. And you? You look like you haven't slept in a week. What's going on? Allison sighed, looking into her cup. She called Linda because she needed someone who would listen, who would understand. Linda, divorced 2 years ago and proud of her new, free life, seemed like the perfect person to talk to. But now that Linda was sitting across from her, Allison suddenly doubted whether to share. I talked to Thomas a couple of days ago, she began, lowering her voice, about opening our marriage. Linda raised her eyebrows, her lips stretching into an interested smile. Seriously? What a twist. And how did he react? Allison shrugged, remembering Thomas's cold gaze at dinner. Strange. Didn't argue, didn't shout. He just said he'd think about it. But he was. Distant. I don't know how to explain. Linda leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Well, it's Thomas. Mr. Control. He's probably just digesting it. Men like him don't like it when their stable little world is shaken. The waiter brought the cappuccino, and Linda immediately took a sip, leaving a red mark on the edge of the cup. "Are you sure you want this?" she asked, looking at Allison over her cup. "An open marriage is not just, let's try. This requires honesty and courage." Allison looked away, feeling her cheeks begin to burn. She didn't tell Linda about Jake, how their chance encounters turned into secret trysts, how his touch made her heart beat faster. Linda knew Allison had met the artist at an exhibition, but didn't know how far it went, and Allison wasn't ready to admit it. "I'm just tired of the routine," she said instead. "10 years, Linda. Thomas and I are like neighbors. I want to feel alive." Linda nodded, her eyes lighting up. "That's why I got divorced. Marriage is a trap if you are not ready to compromise. But an open marriage, this might work. I know couples who live like this. The main thing is the rules. No secrets, no drama." Allison smiled weakly, but inside she was tormented by guilt. No secrets. She has already broken this rule. But Linda's words sounded tempting. Maybe if Thomas agrees, she can be open with Jake without hiding. Maybe this really is the way out. "Tell me," Allison asked, leaning closer. "You've met such couples. How does this work?" Linda grinned, clearly enjoying the moment. "Oh, honey, it's a whole world. For example, my friends Sarah and Mike. They have been married for 7 years, but a couple of years ago, they decided to give it a try. They have rules. Don't bring anyone home, don't fall in love, always use protection. And guess what? They are happy. Sarah says it's like a second wind. She dates whoever she wants, so does Mike, and they still love each other." Allison listened, trying to imagine herself and Thomas in such a scenario. But the image of Thomas with another woman gave her an unexpected pang of jealousy. She brushed the thought aside. "What if one of them oversteps the boundaries?" she asked. "Well, for example, will he fall in love?" Linda shrugged. "Then we need to talk. Honesty is the key. If you hide, everything falls apart." "But Allison," Linda leaned closer, her voice becoming more serious, "if you're already hiding something, you better deal with it now. Secrets in an open marriage are a ticking time bomb." Allison swallowed, feeling Linda's words hit home. She wanted to confess, to talk about Jake, but fear stopped her. Instead, she nodded. "I understand. I just want everything to be okay." Linda smiled, patting her hand. "Will, you're taking a step towards freedom, Allison. It's bold, and Thomas will either go with you or, well, you know. Life is too short to be stuck." Allison forced herself to smile, but inside her thoughts were churning. Linda made it so easy, so natural. Maybe she's right. Maybe an open marriage is what will save her and Thomas, or at least give her time to sort out her feelings for Jake. Meanwhile, Thomas sat in his office, looking at the envelope that the courier had just delivered. His hands shook slightly as he opened it. Inside was a report from the private investigator he had hired 2 days ago. Several pages of text and a stack of photographs. Thomas took a deep breath, preparing for the worst. The first photo made him freeze. Allison stood laughing next to a young man in a loft full of canvases. The man, blonde, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, looked at her the way Thomas had once looked at Allison. The next pictures were even worse. They were hugging, her hand was on his chest, their faces were close, too close. The dates on the photographs confirmed that it was yesterday. Thomas put the pictures aside, feeling a chill creep into his chest. He expected this, but the reality turned out to be harder. His wife, the woman he had loved for over 10 years, was cheating on him. And she didn't just cheat, she offered to open a marriage to cover up her actions. He took out his phone and dialed Margaret. "Thomas," she answered after the first ring. "Did something happen?" "I got the report," he said, his voice level, but inside he was barely holding on. "I have evidence." Margaret paused, then spoke in a businesslike tone. "Fine. Bring everything to me tomorrow. We'll look at what we have and decide how to move forward. Do you want to file for divorce?" Thomas closed his eyes. The word divorce sounded like a sentence. "I don't know. Not yet. But I want to be ready." "I understand," Margaret said softly. Then let's collect more. The more we have, the stronger your position. And Thomas, hang in there. It's hard, but you can do it." He thanked her and hung up. The photographs lay before him like evidence of a crime. He wanted to rush home, throw them in Allison's face, demand an explanation. But instead, he carefully folded them back into the envelope. Margaret was right. Emotion was his enemy now. Allison returned home from her meeting with Linda, feeling a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. The conversation with her friend inspired her, but the words about honesty haunted her. She walked into the living room and froze when she saw Thomas on the sofa. He was watching TV, but the sound was off. "Hi," she said, trying to sound casual. "You're early today." Thomas looked at her, and for a second Allison thought his gaze was heavier than usual. "Yes, I decided to take a break," he replied, turning off the TV. "Where were you?" "I met Linda," she said, taking off her coat. "Just coffee, chatting." Thomas nodded but didn't smile. "Fine. Will you have dinner? Maybe we can order something," she suggested, hoping to diffuse the atmosphere. "Of course," he said, standing up. "Choose." He walked past her into the kitchen, and Allison felt a chill. Something was wrong, but she couldn't figure out what. She took out her phone to order pizza, but her mind was elsewhere. Linda had convinced her that an open marriage was the way to go, but now Allison wasn't so sure. Still, the thought of Jake, of how he made her feel, lingered. She wanted both him and Thomas. But how long can she balance on this edge? Allison stood at the sink, washing the remnants of her morning coffee out of her mugs. Sunday morning in their suburban Chicago home was quiet, almost too quiet. Outside the window, a light wind moved the bare branches of the maples, and the gray sky promised rain. Thomas was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through the news on his tablet, but Allison could tell his attention was not there. In recent days, he had been more silent than usual, and this silence was getting on her nerves. After their conversation about marriage a week ago, she expected him to return to the topic, argue, and ask questions. But he acted as if nothing had happened, and it unsettled her. She dried her hands with a towel and turned to him, trying to keep her voice casual. "Tom, would you like some coffee? I can cook some more." Thomas looked up from the screen, his face calm, almost emotionless. "No, thank you. I'm fine." Allison nodded but didn't move away. She fiddled with the edge of the towel, gathering her courage. The conversation with Linda in the cafe strengthened her resolve, but every time she looked at Thomas, her confidence faded. He had been her rock all these years, the man who knew her best. But now she felt a wall between them, and she needed to see if it could be destroyed or at least made a window in it. "Tom," she began, sitting down opposite him. "I wanted to return to our conversation. Well, about open marriage." Thomas slowly lowered the tablet, his eyes meeting hers. Allison expected to see irritation, or at least surprise, but his gaze was level, almost studying. "Okay," he said, crossing his arms. "Let's talk." Allison hesitated, not expecting such a reaction. She had prepared her arguments, was ready to resist, but his calmness was confusing. "I just wanted to know what you thought," she said, trying to sound confident. "You said you'd think about it, and I'm wondering where you're coming from." Thomas tilted his head slightly, as if weighing his words. Allison noticed his fingers tapping lightly on the table, a subtle sign of tension that she had learned to detect over the years of marriage. "I'm researching this topic," he said finally. "I read some things and looked at what people wrote. It's not something you can just jump into. It takes time to think things through." Allison blinked, her heart skipping a beat. Exploring, she expected him to refuse, to say it wasn't for them. But he sounded like he was actually considering the idea. It was both a relief and a worry. "Seriously?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. "So, you don't mind?" Thomas shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips, but his eyes remained cold. "I didn't say I didn't mind. I said what I thought. It's a big change, Allison. You don't expect me to just say yes and run off. To experiment, do you?" His tone was even, but Allison caught a hint of sarcasm in the last word. She felt her cheeks begin to burn. She wanted to ask what he read, what people inspired him, but something in his gaze stopped her. He looked at her as if he knew more than he was saying. "No, of course," she said, trying to smile. "I'm just glad you're open to talking. We could, discuss the rules or how this could work." Thomas nodded, but his gaze did not soften. "Rules," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "For example?" Allison hesitated. She didn't expect him to get specific so quickly. Linda had mentioned rules: don't bring anyone home, don't fall in love, but Allison wasn't ready to discuss that right now, especially when her thoughts were confused by the memory of Jake. She saw him yesterday in his workshop, and his kisses still burned on her skin. But she couldn't tell Thomas about it. Not now, maybe never. "Well, like being honest with each other," she said, feeling like the words sounded false. "Set boundaries, maybe date others only, with consent." Thomas looked at her, and Allison suddenly felt like she was under a microscope. His silence lasted too long, and she hurried to fill the silence. "I'm not saying we should do something right away," she added. "Just try, see how it goes." Thomas nodded, but his face remained expressionless. "I understand," he said. "Give me a little more time. This is not something that can be resolved in one conversation." Allison forced herself to smile, even though her heart was pounding inside. She got what she wanted. He didn't say no, but somehow she felt worse than before. His calmness, his research, something was wrong. Thomas has never been a man who accepts change easily, and now she couldn't help thinking that he was hiding something. "Okay," she said, standing up. "I'll go take a shower. Then maybe we can go somewhere. Shall we take a walk?" "Maybe," he answered, returning to the tablet. "I will think." Allison walked out of the kitchen, feeling the tension tighten in her chest. She wanted to believe that everything was going according to plan, but her intuition told her that Thomas was playing his game, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to know the rules. Meanwhile, Thomas waited until the sound of water from the bathroom confirmed that Allison was busy. He opened his laptop and went into the folder he had created last week, Documents. Inside were scans of their marriage contract, correspondence with Margaret Wilson, and reports from a private investigator. The photographs of Allison with a young artist were in a separate folder, and every time Thomas opened them, his stomach lurched. But he forced himself to watch. He needed to remember why he was doing this. He opened the letter from Margaret sent last night. "Thomas, I looked at the marriage contract. It is drafted correctly, and in the event of a divorce due to adultery, Allison loses the right to most of the assets, including the house and joint accounts. The photos you provided are a good start, but we need more. Keep collecting evidence. If you decide to move forward, I will prepare the paperwork to file for divorce. Let me know when you're ready. Margaret." Thomas closed the letter, feeling the cold creep through his veins. Divorce. The word still seemed foreign, but every day it became more real. He didn't want this. He loved Allison despite the pain she caused him. But her offer to open the marriage, her lies, it was too much. He couldn't live with a man who betrayed his trust so easily. His conversation with Allison had just confirmed his worst fears. She wanted rules, honesty, but Thomas knew the truth. She had already broken every rule they had, and now he was using her own game against her. He agreed to think and took time so that Margaret could prepare everything she needed. When he's ready, he'll put not only the photos in front of Allison, but also the divorce papers, and then she will understand what she has lost. Thomas closed his laptop and stood up to pour himself some water. His gaze fell on their wedding photograph hanging in the living room. Allison in a white dress, her smile, his hand on her waist. He turned away. Allison had disappeared, and he wasn't sure if he could ever forgive the one who remained. Allison stood under the hot shower, letting the water wash away the tension. She tried to convince herself that the conversation had gone well. Thomas didn't refuse, he thinks. This is progress. But his words, his look, they did not give her peace. She knew Thomas too well. He was not a man who changed his views easily, and his agreement to research, The topic seemed like a trap to her. She turned off the water and wrapped herself in a towel. Her face was reflected in the mirror, tired, with light shadows under her eyes. She looked older than she felt. Jake called her beautiful and said she had a spark. But here in their home with Thomas, she felt like a shadow of herself. Allison left the bathroom and headed to the bedroom to change clothes. Her phone was on the bedside table, and she noticed a new message from Jake. "I miss you. When will we see you?" She smiled, but the smile quickly faded. She wanted to answer, but something stopped her. Instead, she put the phone face down and began to get dressed. Downstairs in the kitchen, Thomas drank his water, looking out the window. He heard Allison's steps upstairs and knew she would be down soon. He will smile, talk about the weather, pretend that everything is fine until he gets everything under control. Allison stood at the window of their small Chicago apartment, looking down at the busy street below. It was June 2014, and the warm wind carried the smell of blooming linden trees. She and Thomas had been married only 2 years, and their lives seemed full of promise. The apartment was modest, with a worn sofa and creaky floors, but to Allison it was home. She turned when she heard the key turning in the lock. Thomas walked in, his face lighting up with a smile when he saw her. "Hello, my love," he said, throwing his briefcase at the door and walking towards her. He hugged her, and Allison inhaled the familiar scent of his cologne. "How is the day?" "Okay," she replied, clinging to him. "Finishing sketches for a client. And you?" Thomas kissed her forehead, his hands on her waist. "Tiring, but productive. I got promoted. Now I manage accounts for a large client. This is a big step." Allison smiled, but felt a slight pang inside. Thomas was rapidly rising through the ranks of his financial firm, and she was proud of him. But her own career as an interior designer was just beginning. She took on small projects, decorated apartments for friends, but there were no large orders. Sometimes she felt like she was falling behind, that her dreams were fading in the shadow of his success. "This is amazing, Tom," she said, trying to sound sincere. "We need to celebrate. Maybe we can go to that Italian restaurant." "Great idea," he replied, his eyes shining. "But first—" He pulled her towards the sofa, and Allison laughed, falling into his arms. They talked about the future, about the house they would buy, about travel, about children. Allison felt weightless, as if their love could overcome anything. Thomas was her rock, and she believed they would build the life they dreamed of. But even then, there were moments when Allison felt empty. Thomas was often late at work, and she spent the evenings alone, drawing sketches or leafing through magazines. She loved him, but sometimes she wanted him to look at her, as in the first months, with delight, with hunger. She brushed these thoughts aside, assuring herself that this was normal. Marriage is work, friends said, and Thomas was a good husband. Allison blinked, and the memory disappeared. She was sitting in the Bean and Brew Cafe, the same one where she had met Linda last week. Today was Tuesday, and the cafe was almost empty, except for a couple of students sitting in the corner with their laptops. Linda was late, as usual, and Allison nervously fiddled with the phone in her hands. It had been a week since their last conversation with Thomas, when he said he was exploring the idea of an open marriage. He was acting colder, and Allison couldn't shake the feeling that he was slipping away. The door dinged, and Linda walked in wearing a bright green coat and huge sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. "Sorry, traffic jams," she said, plopping down on a chair. "Well, what's new? How's it going with Mr. Perfect?" Allison smiled weakly, pushing away the cup of under-consumed latte. "I don't know, Linda. He's weird. He said that he thinks about an open marriage, but I don't believe him. He's hiding something." Linda took off her glasses, her eyebrows raised. "Hiding? Like what? Do you think he has someone?" Allison shook her head, although the thought flashed through. "No, I don't think so. It's just—" He became distant. "I don't know how to explain." Linda snorted, motioning to the waiter. "Men, they either explode or short out. But if he agreed to think, this is a step. And you? Do you still want it?" Allison looked away, gripping the edge of the table. She wanted to talk about Jake, but the words stuck. Instead, she spoke more quietly. I met someone. His name is Jake, artist. He makes me feel wanted. It's like I'm alive again. Linda froze, her eyes lighting up. Wow, this is news. And how far have you come? Allison blushed, looking at the table. Far. I didn't plan it, Linda. It just happened. But now I don't know what to do. I love Thomas, but Jake, he's different. Linda leaned closer, her voice becoming more serious. Listen, Allison, you're not the first. But if you want an open marriage, be honest. Allison shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. I can't. He won't understand, and I'm afraid of losing him. Linda sighed, patting her hand. Then decide what you want. The secret always becomes clear. You can destroy everything good that was between you and your husband with your lies. Allison nodded, but her heart was breaking. She wanted both Thomas and Jake, but knew it was impossible. The thought of losing Jake was unbearable. He saw her as a woman, not a wife or a designer, and that was what she was missing. Thomas sat in Margaret Wilson's office, looking at a folder of documents. Margaret, in a sharp gray suit, leafed through the marriage contract, her pen leaving notes in the margins. The office was elegant, overlooking the city, but Thomas felt only cold determination. The photographs the detective had sent of Allison and the artist lay in his memory like knives. He wasn't going to forgive. His pride, his dignity, did not allow him to cling to a woman who had betrayed his trust. So, Margaret began, closing the folder and looking at him. The contract is ironclad. If you file for divorce on the grounds of infidelity, Allison will get nothing more than what she had before the marriage. House, bills, investments, everything will remain with you. Thomas nodded, his jaw clenched. Margaret's words confirmed what he already knew. He wasn't going to give Allison a second chance. She made her choice when she started dating this artist, when she offered to open their marriage to cover up her lies. He wouldn't let her humiliate him any further. Okay, he said, his voice firm. I want to file for divorce. Start preparing your documents. Margaret looked at him, her gaze attentive but not judgmental. Are you sure, Thomas? This is a big step. If there is even the slightest doubt. No doubt, he interrupted, his eyes burning with cold fire. She cheated on me. She was lying. I will not live with a person who does not respect me. I gave her everything, Margaret, all, and this turned out to be not enough. Margaret nodded, her face becoming businesslike. Fine, I'll start preparing. We have photographs and detective reports, but I recommend gathering more evidence. More the better. Do you want me to file a claim right away, or are you waiting? Thomas thought for a moment. He wanted to strike quickly, but knew that time was on his side. Allison had no idea he knew. Let him think he is in control of the situation. This will make his move even stronger. We're still waiting, he said. I'll let you know when I'm ready, but the documents must be ready. Got it, Margaret replied, making a note. And Thomas, you do what you think is right. Hold on. Thomas nodded, but inside there was nothing but determination. He remembered Allison in their early years, her laughter, her dreams. But that Allison had disappeared, and he wasn't going to cling to the ghost. She betrayed him. Allison returned home from her meeting with Linda, her thoughts scrambled. She walked into the living room and froze when she saw Thomas at the table with his laptop. He looked up, and for a second it seemed to her that the old warmth flashed in his eyes. Hello, she said, taking off her coat. Are you busy? Checking my email, he replied, closing his laptop. Where were you? With Linda, she said, feeling the lie becoming habitual. We drank coffee. Thomas nodded, his smile tight. Fine. Will you have dinner? Yes, let's order something, she suggested, hoping to clear the air. Choose, he said, standing up. I'm in the office. Allison looked after him, feeling the distance between them growing. She wanted to tell the truth, but fear was holding her back. She took out her phone and opened a message from Jake. Are you okay? I want to see you. She smiled, but the smile was bitter. She didn't know how long she could keep everything a secret, and what will happen when the truth comes out. Allison stood at the stove, stirring the lasagna sauce. The aroma of tomatoes and oregano filled the kitchen of their suburban Chicago home, but her hands shook slightly. Outside the window, the November evening shrouded the street in a cold fog, and the light of the lanterns barely broke through the gray veil. She glanced at the table, set with the usual care, a white tablecloth, 2 glasses of wine, candles that she had lit at the last minute. Allison wanted everything to look perfect, as if a beautiful table setting could soften the weight of the conversation she was planning. It had been a week since she'd broached the subject of an open marriage again, and Thomas's responses cold, "I'm exploring," had haunted her. He acted distant, almost alien, and Allison felt like she was losing control. Today, she decided to insist. Linda convinced her that honesty was the key, and although Allison wasn't ready to talk about Jake, she hoped an open marriage would be a compromise. She straightened her black, tight-fitting dress and took a deep breath. The door slammed and footsteps were heard in the hallway. "Hi, honey," she said, turning to the door with a smile. "Dinner is almost ready." Thomas entered the kitchen, loosening his tie. His suit was impeccable, but his eyes were tired, with a cold shine that Allison noticed more and more often. He nodded, placing his briefcase against the wall. "It smells delicious," he said, but his voice was flat, without warmth. "Long day?" "Not really," she answered, pouring the wine. "I met with a client, then cooked." "And you?" "The usual." He accepted the glass, but did not take a sip. "A lot of work." Allison nodded, feeling the tension thicken. They sat down at the table, and she served the lasagna, trying to fill the silence with conversations about little things, about the weather, about a new project, about the neighbor's dog, which had been barking all night again. Thomas answered in monosyllables, and with every word Allison felt more and more insecure. Finally, after a second glass of wine, she made up her mind. "Tom," she began, clearing her throat, "I wanted to return to our conversation about open marriage." Thomas froze, his fork stopping halfway to his plate. He looked up slowly, and Allison felt her heart clench. His eyes were cold, almost alien. "Again," he said quietly, putting down his fork. "You're not giving up, are you?" Allison swallowed, trying to remain confident. "I just think we have to be honest. I want us both to be happy, Tom. And this could be a way out. We could set rules, be open with each other. I've read that many couples do this, and it works." She fell silent, waiting for his reaction. Thomas looked at her, and the silence between them became almost tangible. Allison wanted to continue to explain, but something in his gaze made her freeze. He slowly leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Honest," he repeated, and there was a subtle mockery in his voice. Interesting choice of words. Allison felt the blood rush to her cheeks. She opened her mouth to answer, but Thomas suddenly leaned towards his briefcase lying against the wall. He pulled out a thin black folder and placed it on the table between them. Allison stared at the folder, her heart pounding. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Thomas opened the folder and Allison saw the photographs. Her photographs. She's with Jake in his studio, their smiles, his hand on her waist. The next pictures were worse. They were kissing at the entrance to the loft, her fingers in his hair. Then printouts of messages, her messages to Jake, full of words she never wanted Thomas to see. Allison felt the ground disappear from under her feet. "Tom," she began, but her voice failed. "I know all about your honesty, Allison," he said, his voice calm but steely. "I know about your artist, about your meetings, about how you lied to me, looking into my eyes. Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" Allison shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "Tom, please, it's not what you think. I didn't mean." "You didn't want to," he interrupted, his tone becoming sharper. "Didn't want to cheat on me? Didn't want to propose this open marriage of yours to cover up your actions? Don't lie to me anymore, Allison. I'm tired." She reached out, trying to touch him, but Thomas pulled away. He pulled out another document from the folder and placed it in front of her. Allison looked at him and froze. It was a divorce suit with his signature at the bottom. "I'm filing for divorce," he said, his voice cold and final. "Everything is already prepared. You can read it if you want, but it won't change anything." Allison felt panic wash over her. She grabbed the document, her hands shaking. "Tom, please don't." Her voice broke. "We can talk, I'll explain. I I love you, I didn't mean to hurt you." "Do you love it?" He looked at her, and there was such pain in his eyes that Allison choked. "You call this love? Lies, secrets, another man. I gave you everything, Allison. 10 years, and you spat on it." "It was a mistake," she cried, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Jake, he doesn't mean anything. I'm just confused. That's enough," he snapped, standing up. "I don't want to listen anymore. You have made your choice. Now live with him." Thomas took his coat and headed towards the door. Allison jumped up, running after him. "Tom, please don't go," she shouted, grabbing his sleeve. "Give me a chance, I'll fix everything." He stopped, but didn't turn around. His shoulders were tense, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "You've already ruined everything, Allison. Goodbye." He pulled his hand away and walked out, slamming the door. Allison stood in the hallway, her knees giving way, and she slowly sank to the floor. A folder with photographs and a lawsuit lay on the table like a sentence. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop shaking. Her mind was racing. She wanted to call Thomas, beg him to come back, but knew he wouldn't answer. She wanted to write to Jake, but the thought of him now only brought shame. She was left alone, and for the first time in a long time, she realized that she could lose everything: her home, her family, the life they had built. Allison raised her head, looking at the photographs on the table. Her own face, laughing, happy, next to Jake, now seemed alien to her. She reached out to take the photo, but stopped. Instead, she closed her eyes and tears began to flow down her cheeks again. She didn't know how to fix what she had done. But she knew one thing for sure: Thomas was serious, and he won't come back. Thomas Davis stood in the middle of his new apartment in downtown Chicago, holding a box of books in his hands. The space was minimalist: white walls, large windows overlooking the city, wooden floors that still smelled like fresh varnish. The furniture, a sofa, a table, a bed, had been delivered the day before, but the apartment still seemed empty, alien. He put the box on the floor and wiped the sweat from his brow. The move had been quick, almost mechanical, but every step, from signing the lease to moving things out of their suburban home, reminded him that his life with Allison was a thing of the past. A week has passed since that evening when he put a folder in front of her with evidence of her betrayal and left. Since then, he has not returned home, staying first at a hotel and then signing an agreement for this apartment. Thomas didn't want to see Allison, didn't want to hear her excuses. His pride, his dignity, did not allow him to look back. But at night, when the city fell silent, he lay in the dark, and the memories of her laughter, her touch still cut him like a knife. He pulled out his phone and opened a message from his friend Mike. "Today at 7, O'Malley's Pub." "No excuses, dude." Thomas smiled faintly. Mike and a couple of other friends from college had been his rock in recent days. They didn't ask unnecessary questions, they were just there, and that helped him hold on. He replied, "I will," and began unpacking the boxes. It was a lot of work, and he was grateful for it. The work was a distraction, giving him purpose when everything else fell apart. In the office, on the 23rd floor of a skyscraper, Thomas was immersed in reports. His desk was littered with papers, his monitor screen flickered with graphs. Colleagues noticed that he became even more focused, almost obsessive. Thomas didn't mind. Numbers, forecasts, deadlines, all this was predictable, unlike his personal life. He spent 12 hours in the office, sometimes more, and each completed project gave him the sense of control he craved. During his lunch break, he met Margaret Wilson at a cafe near her office. Margaret, as always, was collected: a dark blue suit, neatly styled gray hair, a penetrating gaze. They sat down at a table by the window, and she immediately got down to business. "I have prepared all the documents for the court," she said, opening the folder. "We have enough evidence: photographs, correspondence, detective reports. The marriage contract is on our side. Allison won't be able to challenge the division of assets if we prove she's unfaithful. Thomas nodded, looking at the papers. The words divorce, assets, infidelity sounded like something from someone else's life, but he forced himself to focus. Has she hired a lawyer yet? He asked, his voice level. Not yet, as far as I know, Margaret answered. But it's a matter of time. I expect she will try to challenge the contract, but she has little chance. Are you sure you want to move on? Thomas looked into her eyes, his jaw clenching. Sure, she made her choice. I'm not going to give her a second chance. Margaret nodded, her face remaining expressionless. Fine. Then we'll file a lawsuit next week. I'll let you know as soon as a hearing date is set. And Thomas, if you need to talk, you know where to find me. Thank you, he said, although he knew he wouldn't take her up on her offer. He didn't want to talk about his feelings. He wanted to move forward, leave the pain behind. In the evening, Thomas entered the O'Malley pub, where Mike and their mutual friend Dan were already waiting for him. The pub was loud, with wooden tables, the smell of beer, and the sounds of old rock and roll from the speakers. Mike, a burly guy with a beard, raised his mug when he saw Thomas. Here he is, a legendary man, he shouted, clapping Thomas on the shoulder. Sit down, have a beer. Come on, Thomas replied, taking off his coat. He sat down and Dan, thin and balding, pushed a plate of fries towards him. How are you, dude? Dan asked, his tone softer than Mike's. New apartment, new life. Thomas took a sip of his beer, feeling the cold bitterness soothing. I'm getting used to it, he said. The apartment is normal. Work is underway. Everything is under control. Mike snorted, leaning back in his chair. Under control, you say? You always say that. But seriously, Tom, you did the right thing by leaving. She didn't deserve you. Thomas nodded, but Mike's words hurt him. He didn't want to discuss Allison, but his friends seemed determined. Listen, Mike continued, leaning closer. You've been an ideal husband for 10 years. And what did you get? Lies and treason. You acted like a man. Pride is important. Mike, that's enough, Dan intervened, glancing at him. It's already hard for Thomas. It's okay, Thomas said, his voice calm, but inside he could feel the pain rising again. I can handle it. Dan looked at him, his eyes full of sympathy. We just want you to be okay, dude. You deserve better, and you will find it, believe me. Thomas smiled faintly, but inside his thoughts were seething. He appreciated his friend's support, but their words couldn't fill the void Allison left. He loved her despite everything. Her laugh, her habit of humming when she cooked, her ambition. But she broke their trust, and that was unforgivable. His pride, his sense of self-worth, demanded that he move on, but his heart still clung to the past. Thanks, guys, he said, raising his mug, for a new start. Here's to a new start. Mike and Dan answered in unison, and their mugs clinked. Later, back at the apartment, Thomas stood at the window, looking out at the city lights. His new life was here in this empty apartment, in long working days, in the support of friends. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Allison, her face when he placed the folder in front of her. Her tears, her pleas. He hated himself for still feeling pain. He wanted to be strong, impenetrable, but the truth was that love did not disappear so easily. He took out his phone and opened a folder with photographs, not the ones the detective had sent, but the old ones of him and Allison. Their wedding, trip to Mexico, picnic by Lake Michigan. He looked at her smile and felt how anger was fighting with melancholy. She betrayed him, lied to him, but he still remembered what it was like to love her. Thomas closed the gallery and put the phone away. He will not allow himself to be weak. Allison made her choice, and he made his. There was a trial ahead, and he was going to come out of this with his head held high. He will rebuild his life, even if it hurts. Because he was Thomas Davis, and he wouldn't allow betrayal power to determine its future. He went to bed, but sleep did not come. In the darkness, he thought about what lay ahead. New apartment, new goals, new life. But somewhere deep inside, he knew that a part of him still belonged to Allison. And this part was the heaviest burden. Allison sat in a cramped lawyer's office on the outskirts of Chicago, clutching her purse. The office was modest. An old wooden table littered with folders, faded wallpaper, the smell of coffee from a cheap coffee maker in the corner. The lawyer, Paul Reed, a man in his 50s with tired eyes and a shabby suit, leafed through the copy of the prenuptial agreement Allison had brought. Outside the window, the December wind blew dry leaves along the sidewalk, and the gray sky reflected her mood. 2 weeks have passed since that evening when Thomas put a folder with evidence of her infidelity in front of her and left, leaving the divorce suit. Since then, her life has fallen apart like a house of cards. Paul put the contract aside and looked at Allison over his glasses. Mrs. Davis, I'll be honest. The contract was drawn up very competently. If there is proven infidelity on your part, and your husband appears to have proof, you lose the right to most of the joint assets. The house, bills, investments, everything will remain with him. Allison felt her throat tighten. She was expecting bad news, but Paul's words hit harder than she thought. Nothing can be done, she asked, her voice trembling. I don't want to be left with nothing. It's not fair. Paul sighed, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. We can try to challenge the contract, but the chances are slim. Your husband has a strong position, especially with photographs and correspondence. My advice is to focus on the negotiations. If you can negotiate with him, it may soften the blow. Allison shook her head, her fingers tightening on her purse. He doesn't want to talk to me. I called, wrote, but he ignored me. Paul nodded, his face sympathetic but businesslike. Then we'll have to work with what we have. I will prepare a request for mediation, but you must be prepared for him to refuse. And, Mrs. Davis, you need to get yourself together. The trial will be difficult, especially if rumors of your divorce are already spreading. Allison looked away, feeling her cheeks burn. Rumors. She had already noticed sidelong glances from neighbors, whispers at meetings with clients. Chicago was a big city, but gossip spread quickly, especially in her circles. People knew Thomas was gone, and many seemed to have drawn their own conclusions. She couldn't blame them. She had ruined her own marriage. But that didn't make the pain any less acute. I understand, she said quietly. How much time do we have? The trial is scheduled for early February, Paul replied. We have a couple of months to prepare. I'll do my best, but you need to be realistic. Allison nodded, although she was panicking inside. She thanked Paul and left the office, feeling the cold wind burn her face. She stopped on the sidewalk, looking at the passing cars. Her life, which she had so carefully built, was crumbling, and she did not know how to stop it. Returning to the house, the one that could soon no longer be hers, Allison threw her purse on the sofa and turned on the kettle. The silence in the house was deafening. Without Thomas, everything seemed empty. His coat wasn't hanging in the hallway, his books weren't on the coffee table, his scent was gone. She tried not to think about him, but every corner of the house reminded her of the past. She took out her phone and opened their correspondence. The last message she sent yesterday went unanswered. Tom, please, let's talk. I know it's my fault, but I want to make things right. She knew he wouldn't answer. Thomas was adamant, and his silence was louder than any words. Allison put her phone down and closed her eyes, trying to hold back her tears. She hated herself for what she had done, for Jake, for the lie. But what she hated most was that she had lost Thomas, the man who had been her rock for 10 years. To distract herself, she opened her laptop and started checking her email. Among the spam and invoices was a letter from a new client, Mrs. Claire Evans, who wanted to remodel the living room in her townhouse. Allison grabbed onto this project like a lifeline. Work had always been her refuge, a place where she felt competent and needed. She wrote back to Claire asking her to meet next week and began sketching. She needed something that would keep her afloat, even if everything else was falling apart. But even work was not a safe zone. The next day, at a meeting with another client, Allison noticed that Mr. Brown was acting more reserved than usual. He was polite, but his questions about deadlines and budgets sounded strained, and his gaze kept wandering. When Allison mentioned that she might bring in an additional contractor, he interrupted her. "Listen, Allison," he said, lowering his voice. "I heard about your situation. Divorce, right? Just want to make sure it doesn't affect the project." Allison felt the blood rush to her cheeks. She forced herself to smile, although everything was boiling inside. "My personal life does not affect my work, Mr. Brown," she said, trying to keep her voice firm. "I'm a professional." Of course," he nodded, but his smile was forced. "Just checking." Allison ended the meeting, but Brown's words echoed in her head. Rumors spread and her reputation, which she had built over the years, began to come apart at the seams. She knew that in their circle designers, clients, contractors' news of the divorce and her infidelity would become fuel for gossip, and it scared her more than she wanted to admit. That evening, Allison sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by sketches for Claire Evans' project. She drew lines, selected colors, but her thoughts were far away. She remembered Thomas, his smile, his habit of reading newspaper articles to her in the morning, his warmth next to her in bed. She wanted to call him, beg him to meet, but knew it was useless. Instead, she wrote another message. "Tom, I know you don't want to talk, but I'm asking for just one meeting. Please." She hit send, but the screen remained blank. Allison put her phone down and buried her face in her hands. She tried to find a way out, but every step led her deeper into the abyss. The lawyer, the job, even her own attempts to correct the mistakes, nothing worked. She was alone, and for the first time in her life, she didn't know how to move on. Her gaze fell on the sketch she was drawing of the living room. The space was bright, open, full of life the way she wanted her own life. But now she felt locked in a dark room without doors. She picked up her pencil and began to draw again, with a tenacity that was her last defense. If she couldn't save her marriage, she would at least save herself. But even this seemed almost impossible to her. The courtroom in downtown Chicago was cold and sterile, with high ceilings and rows of wooden benches that smelled of varnish. Allison sat at the table next to her lawyer, Paul Reed, clasping her hands in her lap to stop shaking. Her dark blue dress, chosen to look professional, felt too tight and the air in the room felt heavy. Opposite, at another table, sat Thomas, his face inscrutable, his eyes fixed on the judge. Next to him, Margaret Wilson, in a sharp gray suit, laid out documents with such confidence that Allison felt even more vulnerable. 2 months have passed since the evening when Thomas left, leaving the divorce case. 2 months full of sleepless nights, tears, and desperate attempts to find a way out. Allison hoped that the court would give her a chance that she could challenge the marriage contract and save at least something from their life together. But now, sitting here, under the gaze of the judge and the whispers of the few spectators, she felt hope slipping away. The judge, an elderly woman with a stern face, tapped her gavel to call for order. Paul leaned over to Allison and whispered, "Hold on. We'll do everything we can." Allison nodded, but her throat tightened. She knew their position was weak. Paul warned that evidence of infidelity photographs, correspondence, detective reports leaves almost no chance, but she couldn't just give up. Margaret stood up, her voice clear and confident. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Thomas Davis, is filing for divorce on the grounds of adultery on the part of Mrs. Allison Davis. We have compelling evidence, including photographs, correspondence, and financial records, linking Mrs. Davis to a third party. According to the prenuptial agreement signed by the parties before the wedding, infidelity will deprive Mrs. Davis of the right to joint assets, including the house, accounts, and investments." The judge nodded, flipping through the documents in front of her. "Continue, Miss Wilson." Margaret began presenting evidence. Photographs of Allison with Jake, printouts of messages where she wrote to him words that now burned her with shame. Allison looked down, feeling her cheeks heat up. She wanted to scream, to explain that it was a mistake, that she loved Thomas, but she knew that her words would not change anything. Thomas sat motionless, his face like a mask, and Allison couldn't tell if he felt anything. Paul stood up when it was their turn. "Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Davis, admits her mistakes, but we ask that the terms of the contract be reconsidered. Mrs. Davis made significant contributions to their life together, including providing emotional and professional support to Mr. Davis. We believe that the complete stripping of her assets is unfair. Allison looked at Paul, hoping his words would resonate. But the judge remained impassive, and Margaret immediately objected. Your Honor, Mrs. Davis' contribution is not in dispute, but the contract clearly states the consequences of infidelity. My client fulfilled all of his obligations, while Mrs. Davis knowingly violated them. We ask that you comply with the terms of the agreement. Allison felt her heart clench. She looked at Thomas, hoping to catch his eye, but he stared straight ahead as if she didn't exist. She wanted to stand up, scream for him to look at her, to remember who they were. But she remained where she was, chained to the chair with fear and shame. The judge closed the folder and looked at both sides. I reviewed the evidence and the contract. Given the facts presented, I am inclined to support the terms of the prenuptial agreement. However, I will give the parties the opportunity to present additional arguments before making a final decision. The hearing will continue in a week. Allison felt hope flare up, but Paul leaned over and whispered, "This is a formality. There is little chance. We need to prepare for the worst." She nodded, but everything inside was screaming. The worst has already come. A week later, the judge made her decision. Allison sat in the same room, feeling time slow down. The judge's voice sounded like an echo. Based on the evidence presented and the terms of the prenuptial agreement, I find that Mr. Thomas Davis retains title to all marital assets, including the home, accounts, and investments. Mrs. Allison Davis retains her personal funds and premarital property. Allison closed her eyes, feeling the world fall apart. The house, their home, where they planned the future, where she cooked dinners and dreamed of children, now belonged to Thomas. She lost not only him, but everything they had built. Paul put his hand on her shoulder, but his sympathy only increased her pain. Thomas stood up, his face expressionless. He didn't look at her. He simply walked out of the hall with Margaret. Allison sat until the room was empty, unable to move. She felt defeated, crushed. But somewhere deep inside, under a layer of pain and shame, a spark of stubbornness smoldered. She won't let this break her. She will start again, even if it is the most difficult thing in her life. A week later, Allison moved into a small apartment in a less prestigious area of Chicago. One room, with threadbare wallpaper and creaky floors, it was a far cry from their spacious home in the suburbs. Allison unpacked boxes, trying not to think about how far she had fallen. Her savings were meager, and without Thomas's support, she would have to start from scratch. But she was determined. She pulled out her laptop and opened up sketches for a project by Claire Evans, a client who still trusted her. Work was her only anchor. Allison knew that rumors about the divorce and her infidelity continued to spread, and some clients had already refused to cooperate. But she wasn't going to give up. She will draw, create, prove that she is more than her mistakes. In the evening, sitting on a narrow sofa with a cup of tea, Allison looked out the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something like determination. She lost Thomas, her home, her reputation, but she didn't lose herself, and that was enough to start over. She picked up her phone and texted Linda, "Moved. New apartment Artera, new life. Tomorrow I'll start with a clean slate." The answer came almost immediately. "You are stronger than you think. Hold on." Allison smiled, although the smile was weak. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in months, she felt like she had a chance. Small, but her own. Allison sat on the floor of her small apartment, surrounded by sketches and colored pencils. Outside the window, February snow was falling in soft flakes, covering the Chicago streets with a thin white layer. The apartment was cold, despite the heater being on, and Allison was bundled up in an old wool sweater that had once belonged to Thomas. She hadn't worn it for months, but today, on another evening, when loneliness hit especially hard, she took it out of the box. The smell of his cologne had long since faded, but the fabric still held memories. A month has passed since the trial, where she lost her home, most of her savings, and the remains of her reputation. Allison tried to hold on, but depression crept up unnoticed. In the morning, she would lie in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, and at night she would be tormented by nightmares about Thomas, about his cold gaze that evening when he left. She hated herself for her weakness, for the tears that still flowed whenever she saw their old wedding photo in the box. But most of all, she hated silence. This apartment, with its creaky floors and thin walls, was too quiet without Thomas. Allison picked up a pencil and started drawing, trying to distract herself. Her new project for Claire Evans, a client who stuck with her despite the rumors, was her lifeline. Claire wanted to transform her living room into a nature-inspired space, with warm tones and natural materials. Allison threw herself into her work, creating sketches with flowing lines and soft textures. Every stroke, every color choice gave her a sense of control that was so lacking in the rest of her life. There was a knock on the door, and Allison jumped. She wasn't expecting guests. Linda was the only one who came in, but even she rarely appeared. Allison stood up, straightened her sweater, and opened the door. Claire Evans stood in the doorway, wearing an elegant coat and a warm smile. Her red hair was pulled back into a loose bun, and she was holding a paper bag in her hands. "I hope I'm not too arrogant," Claire said, her voice soft but confident. "I was nearby and thought I could drop off tissue samples. And she brought cupcakes." Allison blinked, not expecting such a visit. She forced herself to smile. "No, of course, come in. Sorry about the mess." Claire walked in, looking around the apartment. Allison suddenly felt embarrassed by the bare walls and the boxes she still hadn't unpacked. But Claire didn't seem to notice. She put the bag on the table and pulled out a box of cupcakes that smelled like vanilla and chocolate. "I saw your latest sketches," Claire said, sitting down on the sofa. "They're amazing, Allison. You have a talent for creating comfort. You know, I want my living room to be a place where people feel at home." Allison sat down opposite her, feeling the warmth of Claire's words dispel the cold in her chest. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'm trying. It helps me hold on." Claire looked at her, her gaze attentive but not intrusive. "I heard about your divorce," she said carefully. "I don't want to get in the way, but you're strong. The fact that you continue to work and create speaks volumes." Allison looked away, her fingers gripping the hem of her sweater. She was not used to such open support, especially from a client. "Sometimes I don't feel strong," she admitted, her voice shaking. "But work, that's all I have left." Claire nodded, her smile warm. "Then hold on to it. And you know, if you want to drink coffee or just chat, I'm always here. You are not alone, Allison." Allison felt tears welling up, but she forced herself to smile. "Thank you, Claire. It means a lot." They talked for another hour, discussing fabrics, colors, and ideas for the living room. Claire was enthusiastic, and her energy was infectious. When she left, Allison returned to her sketches with renewed determination. Claire reminded her that she can still create beauty even if her own life seems to be in ruins, and that was enough to continue. Meanwhile, Thomas was sitting in a restaurant in downtown Chicago, opposite a woman named Sarah. She was a colleague from the next apartment, tall, with dark hair and a witty smile. Their first date was arranged by Mike, who insisted it was time for Thomas to move on. Sarah ordered a glass of white wine and talked about her recent trip to Italy, her voice light and her laugh infectious. But Thomas barely listened. His thoughts were somewhere far away. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, leaning closer. "You're kind of absent." Thomas forced himself to smile as he took a sip of his coffee. "Sorry, I'm just tired. Job." Sarah nodded, but her gaze was penetrating. "Work or something else?" "Look, Thomas, I'm not pushing, but if you're not ready for this, that's okay." He looked at her, and for a second he wanted to be honest. To say that he still thinks about Allison, that her betrayal has left a hole in him that he doesn't know how to fill. But instead, he shook his head. "Everything is fine," he said. "It just takes time." Sarah smiled, but her eyes said that she understood more than he said. The dinner was pleasant, but when they said goodbye at the restaurant entrance, Thomas knew he wouldn't call her again. He wasn't ready. Not to Sarah, not to anyone else. His heart, despite his anger and pride, still belonged to Allison, and this infuriated him most of all. Back at his apartment, Thomas stood at the window, looking out at the snow-covered city. He missed Allison, her voice, her habit of leaving coffee cups on the table, the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't noticing. But every time he remembered her with Jake, photographs, correspondence, his anger returned like a wave. He couldn't forgive. I didn't want to. His pride was all he had left, and he clung to it like armor. He took out his phone and opened their old correspondence. The last message from Allison, sent a month ago, went unanswered. Tom, I know you don't want to talk, but I'm asking for one meeting. Please. He looked at the words, feeling pain and anger fighting inside. He wanted to write, to say that she had destroyed everything they had. But instead, he closed the app and put the phone down. Thomas went to bed, but sleep did not come. He thought about Sarah, about her smile, about how easy it would be to start something new. But the truth was that he didn't want anything new. He wanted what was before the lies, before the betrayal. And this thought was the most difficult, because he knew that the past could not be returned. Allison finished the sketch and put her pencil down. Her fingers ached, but she felt satisfied. Claire's living room was starting to take shape on paper, and that was a small victory. She got up to make tea and looked at the snow outside the window. The loneliness still weighed heavily, but today it was a little easier. Claire, her work, her stubbornness, these were her weapons against depression. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could handle it, even alone. Allison had been staring at the blank page for an hour, trying to find the words. Writing to Thomas had been her idea, but now that the pen was in her hand, every word felt wrong. Allison took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and began to write. Dear Tom, I don't know if you'll read this, and frankly, I don't expect an answer. But I have to say this because otherwise I won't be able to move on. It's my fault. I betrayed you, our love, our marriage. I lied to you, and there is no excuse for what I did. Jake was a mistake, but the truth is that I let it happen because I was weak, because I was looking for something I was missing instead of talking to you. I don't ask for forgiveness because I know I don't deserve it, but I want you to know that I loved you. I still love you, even if it doesn't mean anything after everything I've done. You were my home, my support, and I destroyed it. I live with this every day, and it's worse than losing a house or money. I lost you, and this is my biggest mistake. I'm not writing to get you back. I'm writing to say I'm sorry, and to thank you for the 10 years you gave me. I wish you happiness, Tom. You deserve it more than anyone. Allison. She reread the letter, feeling tears sting her eyes. Every word was the truth, torn from the depths of her soul, but she knew that it would not change anything. Thomas won't answer. He hasn't responded to her texts, hasn't spoken to her since the night he left, and yet she had to do it. Not for him, but for yourself. To close this chapter, to stop carrying guilt like a stone around your neck. Allison folded the letter, put it in an envelope, and wrote Thomas's address, his new apartment, which she found out through mutual friends. She didn't allow herself to change her mind. She immediately left the house and threw the envelope into the mailbox on the corner. The cold wind hit her face, but she felt a strange relief. She did what she had to do. Now she needed to move on. Thomas returned to his apartment late that evening, leaving his briefcase at the door. It had been a long day at the office, full of meetings and reports, and he was glad for the silence. He noticed an envelope on the table. His neighbor on the landing, who sometimes picked up the mail, had left it there. The address was written in familiar handwriting, and Thomas froze. Allison. His fingers trembled as he took the envelope, but he forced himself to open it. He sat down on the sofa and began to read. Each word was like a blow, not an angry one, but a quiet one, penetrating deeply. Her apology, her confession, her love. Thomas felt his throat tighten. He hated himself for still feeling something when he read her words. He wanted to be indifferent, wanted his anger and pride to drown out everything else. But the truth was that he missed her. By their lives, by who they were before her betrayal. He read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and put it in his desk drawer. Answer: he didn't know what to say. His anger still burned, but her words made a dent in his armor. She admitted her guilt and did not ask for anything in return. This was not like Allison, who lied to him, who ruined their marriage. But that didn't change the past. He couldn't forgive, couldn't trust her again. His pride, his pain did not allow it. Thomas stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. He thought about Sarah, the woman he had dated a couple of weeks ago. She was kind, smart, but he felt nothing but emptiness. He thought about Allison, about her laugh, about the way she sang in the shower, and he hated himself for still loving her despite everything. He decided not to answer. Not now, maybe never. The letter was her attempt at atonement, but it couldn't erase what she had done. He closed the drawer and turned off the light. He needed to move on, even if it meant living with this pain. Allison sat in the therapist's office, a small room with a soft sofa and watercolor paintings on the walls. Dr. Laura Miller, a woman in her 40s with warm eyes, sat opposite her, holding a clipboard. Allison started going to her a week ago on the advice of Claire, who noticed how difficult it was for her to be alone. This was her third session, and the first time Allison felt she could speak openly. "I wrote a letter to Thomas," she said, looking at her hands. She apologized. She said, "I was sorry. I don't expect him to answer, but I needed to do it." Laura nodded, her voice soft. "This is a big step, Allison. How do you feel after this?" Allison thought, fiddling with the hem of her sweater. "Easier. A little. It was as if I had let go of some of the guilt. But I don't know who I am without him. Without our marriage. I try to work, to create, but sometimes I feel like I'm faking it." Laura leaned closer, her gaze intent. "You're not pretending. You are building a new version of yourself. It's difficult, it hurts, but every step is progress. What is helping you now? What gives you strength?" Allison thought about Claire, about her project, about how her work made her feel alive. "My job," she said, "and people who believe in me. Claire, my client. You, even Linda, although she doesn't always understand." Laura smiled. "This is important. You have a foundation to build on, and you are already taking steps writing therapy. You don't stand still." Allison nodded, feeling the warmth of her words dispel the cold inside. "Therapy wasn't easy. Talking about my mistakes, about Jake, about the pain was like opening up old wounds. But with each session, she felt a little stronger, a little clearer. She wanted to understand why she did what she did, why she looked to Jake for what was missing in the marriage, and she wanted to learn to live with herself, with her mistakes. "I want to be better," she said quietly. "Not for Thomas, not for anyone else. For myself." Laura nodded, her eyes full of encouragement. "And you will. It's a process, Allison. Give yourself time." The session ended and Allison walked outside, feeling the spring air fill her lungs. She wasn't okay, not completely, but she was on her way, and that was enough. She took out her phone and texted Claire, "Ready, show new sketches. Tomorrow at 10, the answer came almost immediately. "I'm looking forward to it. Well done." Allison smiled. For the first time in a long time, the smile was sincere. Allison stood in the center of her new design studio, a small space in a busy Chicago neighborhood. The walls were painted a soft cream color, the floor was warm wood laminate, and the large windows let in the April light, filling the space with warmth. On the table were sketches, fabric samples, and a cup of coffee already cold. There was a sign above the door, "Allison Davis Design." It was a humble beginning, but it meant everything to Allison. After months of struggle, depression, and therapy, she finally felt like she was standing on her own 2 feet. Opening a studio was a risky move. Her savings were almost gone, and she took out a small loan to rent space and buy equipment. But the project for Claire Evans, completed with triumph, brought her first clients. Claire praised her work in her circles, and Allison soon received orders to decorate 2 offices and a private library. Rumors of her divorce still swirled, but her talent spoke louder than the gossip. People saw her sketches, her attention to detail, and it began to change their minds. Allison straightened the frame with a photo, not a wedding photo, not with Thomas, but a photo of herself at the opening of the studio, with a smile that she was proud of. She was alone on this path, but for the first time loneliness did not frighten her. Therapy with Dr. Laura Miller helped her understand her mistakes, why she sought salvation in Jake, why she could not be honest with Thomas. She learned to accept herself not ideal, but striving for better. The doorbell rang and Allison turned. Claire Evans entered the studio, wearing a light spring coat and her usual warm smile. "Allison, this place is a dream," Claire exclaimed, looking around the studio. "You did it. I'm so proud of you." Allison smiled, feeling warmth in her chest. "Thank you, Claire. I couldn't have done it without your support." Claire waved it off, placing the bag of croissants on the table. "Nonsense. You pulled yourself out. Now tell me how things are going." "New clients?" Allison nodded, sitting down opposite her. She began talking about her latest project, decorating an office for a startup that wanted a bright, inspiring space. Claire listened, asking questions, and Allison felt her confidence grow. She was no longer the woman who hid from her guilt. She was a designer, a professional, a person who was rebuilding her life. "And you?" Claire asked, taking a sip of her coffee. "How are you? Not only work, but you." Allison thought as she looked at her hands. She still missed Thomas, but the pain had faded, like an old scar. The letter she wrote to him a month ago remained unanswered, and she accepted it. She didn't expect forgiveness, but it gave her peace. "I'm fine," she said quietly. "For the first time in a long time, I feel free. I don't know how to explain. I'm not running from the past, but I'm building something new." Claire nodded, her eyes full of encouragement. "This is a new life, Allison. You deserve it." Allison smiled, and this time the smile was genuine. She knew there would be difficulties ahead, loans, competition, moments of doubt. But she was ready. She had a studio, clients, and most importantly, herself. And that was enough. Meanwhile, Thomas was sitting in a cafe in downtown Chicago, opposite a woman named Emma. She was a lawyer. They met through mutual friends a couple of weeks ago. Emma was smart, with short brown hair and a laugh that made people turn heads. Their third date was easy. They talked about books, travel, and the Chicago spring. But Thomas, despite her company, felt distant. "You're quiet today," Emma said, leaning closer. Her eyes were attentive, but not judgmental. "Everything is fine." Thomas forced himself to smile as he took a sip of his coffee. "Yes, I was just thinking. Sorry." Emma nodded, but her look said she was noticing more than he was saying. "Job or something personal?" Thomas looked at her, and for a second he wanted to be honest. To say that he thinks about Allison, that her letter, which he reread yesterday, is still in his desk drawer. But instead he shrugged. "A little of this, a little of that. Nothing serious." Emma smiled, but her smile was soft, almost sympathetic. "You know, Thomas, you don't have to pretend. If you need time, I understand." He nodded, feeling grateful for her understanding. Emma was wonderful, kind, smart, open. But every time he looked at her, he couldn't help but compare her to Allison. Her laugh was not like Allison's. Her gestures, her way of speaking, everything was different. And it made him angry because he wanted to move on. He wanted to leave the past behind him. But Allison's letter, her words, "I loved you, I still love you," haunted him. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I appreciate it." They finished dinner, and Thomas walked Emma to her car. She kissed him on the cheek, and he promised to call, but they both knew he probably wouldn't. When she left, Thomas remained on the sidewalk, looking at the spring city. He felt lost, as if his life was a puzzle with a piece missing. Emma could have been part of the new picture, but he wasn't ready. Not now. Returning to the apartment, Thomas took Allison's letter from the drawer. He reread it, feeling a familiar pain squeezing his chest. He missed her, but the anger and betrayal were still strong. He did not answer the letter and did not intend to. But he didn't throw it away. It sat in the box as a reminder of what he had lost and why he couldn't come back. Allison finished the day in the studio, closing her laptop. Her last client, a cafe owner, was delighted with her sketches, and it gave her strength. She went outside, feeling the spring air filling her lungs. The city was alive, full of sounds and light, and she suddenly realized that for the first time in a long time she was not afraid of the future. She had a studio, clients, and confidence, which she built bit by bit. She was independent, and that was her victory. She took out her phone and texted Claire, "New order in my pocket. Thank you for believing in me." The answer came almost immediately, "You are a star, Allison. I'm proud of you." Allison smiled as she looked out at the city lights. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, but she was ready. For the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged to herself. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.